Hi, everyone. My name is Esther Mwaniki. I am the founder and the CEO of an organization known as Lapid Leaders Africa, that's based in Kenya. Our mission as Lapid Leaders Africa is to ignite the prowess of the next generation of African leaders. And when we think about igniting the prowess of the next generation of African leaders, we think about what it looks like for our youth to become the leaders that Africa needs. And that's in the context of leading people, leading change, and ultimately, obviously, in today's world, leading the planet. I wanted to just start by saying a very big thank you for inviting me to be part of your conversation around climate change. A very big thank you to the executive director for the invitation. A bigger thank you to my brother, Martin, for the invitation. It's an honor and a privilege to be part of your conversation. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be there or even in a live conversation, but we thought I'd do a recording that you can then use to have your conversation. My hope is that this conversation ignites some thoughts for you, and that more than that, it helps you to be able to move forward the conversation at COP and even further as we have the conversation for climate change. I will be honest and I will say that I have been very hesitant about doing conversations for climate in the recent past. We were preparing for COP and we looked at the notes for the last COP and we just thought nothing has changed. You could literally just pick up the last conversations and just change a few things. We were working with a different organization on this. And I think that's perhaps part of the challenges that we have in today's climate conversations. As we go into COP29, there's a question of, are these conversations making a difference? And I think that's a real question that we must sit with and grapple with. But the reason I still have hope is early this year, we had a fantastic conversation with our friends in the US from Taproot Earth. I'm not sure if they're going to be joining you. If they are, but big hello to them. Taproot Earth is led by a lady that I respect greatly. She's called Colette, and we partner with them to host a global climate reparations governance assembly in Nairobi. Colette and I are both Obama fellows, and we connected around the mission around Black liberation and seeing all of these conversations, all of these fights, not in isolation in terms of Kenyans, isolated in terms of Nigerians, isolated in terms of Africans. I think it's as you start to interact with all Black communities across the world, you hear the same things, whether it's in Brazil, whether it's in Haiti, whether it's in America, whether it's in UK, you find the Black communities across the world are facing the same challenges, that we are the poorest, we're the ones who are most impacted by the climate change. And so the reason that we connected with Colette and had this Global Climate Reparations Governance Assembly is we saw that commonality, that it's important for each of these communities to combine our power and have conversations that are one community being able to propel the conversation forward. And I think for me, that's one of the things I'd like to offer into this conference. I am increasingly convinced that there's nothing that we can do as Kenyans alone, as Nigerians alone, as Africans alone. We need to have the conversation around what does it look like for us to be at the center of building Black-led movements that make change conversation more real. I am an imagination-driven leader, and one of the things that I imagine is a world where we are actually leading COP. I actually think that Black communities need to aggregate and actually build a COP that's led by Black communities. And the reason for that is if we are the most affected by the climate change, we have no business being part of a conversation that moves into COP1, COP2 to COP29. This is an emergency for our communities. And so perhaps there's an opportunity for us to be able to aggregate together and put together communities and conversations that are Black-led COP conversations. And we've had this conversation with Colette. I think we've also had this conversation with Martin. And my hope is that's something that at some point we will make a reality. So I've put together some thoughts that I'm just going to share very briefly. I'm going to start with something that I'm sure all of us have spent quite a bit of time on and understanding. So my conversation is supposed to be around channeling action towards just, I think that's a conversation you're having, channeling action towards just and sustainable climate financing. And I'm specifically going to be talking about how loss and damage can rescue frontline communities from an ending climate catastrophe. Let me also just say, even before I go to some of the notes that I put together, my background is actually in banking. I worked for a bank in Kenya. more of accounting, audit, and banking. I started my professional life in an organization called PricewaterhouseCoopers. Was very big in the audit space. I landed in UK at some point and worked in some of the largest mergers in the UK of Lloyd's Banking Group, that formed the Lloyd's Banking Group. But that was around when we had the financial crisis in 2009, and started to see how these were just numbers, but in the final end, we weren't connecting with the idea of this is not just numbers, but these are people who are impacted by this financial crisis. That when the banks collapse, it's not just banks collapsing. This is people's livelihoods that are being impacted. And I think that started a process towards me stepping away from the financial institutions. So worked with PwC for about 8 years, worked in GT Bank, and I wanted to bring that here. Guarantee Trust Bank. Guarantee Trust Bank is a Nigeria-led bank that's based here. I was the head of risk and compliance and started to work with the Nigerian community. We clashed a lot. I tell people this is when just Kenyans and Nigerians are starting to get along for the longest time. We seemed to have seen the world from very different perspectives. But again, that whole process just enabled me to start to think about the power of corporate institution in driving impact. And I think even as we have this conversation of climate finance, loss and damage fund, we must challenge ourselves to ask, how are we holding corporate organizations accountable? It's not enough for us to have conversations at COP. It's not enough for us to hold governments accountable. We must do that. We also must ask the question of what role is corporates and corporate organizations playing in the climate financing and climate change preparation. And that's something that I would just wanted to highlight even before I go into my notes. So I just wanted to just share a few thoughts, and I'm just going to run through this. I will share with Martin the detailed notes, and we could perhaps organize another day to have a different conversations around it. I will start with just a basic understanding of loss and damage, just in case there are people here who haven't been involved in this conversation. I'll do a background around the loss and damage, where it's coming from, just a basic understanding of that. I'll talk about the usual, which is around the disappropriate burden of Africa in terms of the climate change. I will bring that just to set the context. I'm going to talk about the role of the wealthiest in the climate impact, because I think that's still important in this conversation. I'm going to do a quick critique of the carbon credit pathway, which is something that has been presented by very many people as a possibility for solution for climate change in Africa. I am a huge believer that we cannot fall for that lie. And so I'm going to do that very briefly. And then I will spend some time on some conversations around what are some of the things that we could be talking about as far as the loss and damage fund goes in COP29. And I'll just share some thoughts around that, and I will use that to conclude this conversation. So let me start with talking about just a historical context of the loss and damage. And I do this because my hope is we have in the conversation some young people. My hope is also we have some people who haven't heard about loss and damage, because I think one of the bigger things we must challenge ourselves as movements, as activists, as advocates of change, is to make sure that the rooms that we are in have people who have not been part of conversations of climate change before. I think there is a way we isolate ourselves and we end up in echo chamber kind of conversations where we repeat what we all know. I think it's important for us to start to think in the context of how do we bring in rooms, people who haven't been part of this conversation. So the term loss and damage covers the irreversible impact of climate change that exceed adaptation capacity. This includes the destruction of homes, the loss of livelihoods, the forced migration, and the erosion of cultural heritage that results from the climate change. And this concept of loss and damage was first formally recognized in COP29 in 2013. And this is part of the reason why this whole conversation is very frustrating. In 2013, we formally recognized loss and damage with the establishment of the WASO International Mechanism, and the mechanism aimed to address loss and damage associated with climate impact, especially in vulnerable regions. And I think at that point, we were recognizing that it's not just about climate change, it's the loss and the damage that results from climate change that's beyond adaptation. I mean, there's an element of some things people have to adapt, but there's a loss and damage that's beyond the adaptation, and that's where the fund came about. However, without dedicated finance, the mechanism fell short of supporting communities at the scale that was required. And in 2015, context again, the Paris Agreement further recognized the loss and damage kind of requirement, and this was a big milestone. a big milestone, but high emission countries, developed economies, China, America, and UK and others, and Europe were concerned about the legal liabilities and so opposed a direct funding mechanism. This was in 2015. There was a whole idea of they don't want to be recognized or accept a legal liability. I think that's still a hurdle that we have to face today. But at least in COP27 in 2022, the international community committed to creating a loss and damage fund, and that was a crucial step towards climate justice. But despite this breakthrough, the fund remains non-operational. And so we've done this journey in the last the last 10 years of recognizing loss and damage, fighting the legal liabilities behind it, saying we want to do a fund. But even as we speak in 2024, there is hardly much that has gone into making this fund operational. And the key decisions on the governance, the funding sources, and the disbursement mechanisms are still pending. And so that underscores the urgency of COP29 in terms of making this fund a reality. So that's sort of some historical background, some context around why this is an important conversation for Africa, why this is an important conversation for Black-led communities. As I mentioned earlier, I'm increasingly thinking of Africans, but Black communities across the world as well, because you will find the same challenge in Black communities in Brazil. I remember the first time I had this conversation with one of the people within the communities of Taproot Earth, and we were talking about how more than half of the population in Brazil is Black people. A lot of us, when you think about Brazil, you don't think about the Black people in that context. And that's why we must constantly challenge ourselves, not just to think about Africa and how it's connected with this climate change, but to think about this from a Black-led communities across the world. So, but let's come home. Africa contributes less than 4% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, yet it suffers a disappropriate share of the climate impact. And these impacts are not just environmental, they're economic, they're social, and they're cultural. Just this past April in Kenya, we experienced devastating floods, the kind we've not seen in more than 60 years. It led to displaced communities, it led to a wake of destruction. And the reason I think this is a big deal is because Kenya is one of the few countries at the equator. Because of that, we hardly experience extreme weather. But this flooding was to an extent that we haven't seen ever. And the bursting of dams in Great Rift Valley left around 50 people dead. We left thousands displaced. And it exposed just how much the region is vulnerable to climate-related disasters. And I remember actually sitting and praying and saying, this climate disaster has to pass. We just don't have the capacity to deal with it. I remember watching just the government be helpless. I remember looking through our debt levels and thinking, we're spending all our money repaying debts. We hardly have time to prepare for such disasters. And while that's the scenario in Kenya, it was the same thing that was happening across East Africa, in Burundi, in Brazil, in many other places, with the same situation that was happening. High levels of deaths and displaced lives and an inability to handle that disaster. And some data from African Development Bank indicates that the climate disasters and hazards have historically resulted in a 5 to 15% annual GDP loss across the continent. So about 5 to 15% is being lost in a continent that's already poor enough to climate-related issues. But when they look forward, they anticipate that in the next few years, this will go up by at least 12%. This is tragic when you think about it. It's one thing for us to already be losing 5 to 15% of our annual GDP to losses that are related to the climate. Now, when you start to say in the next few years, you're going to be losing 12% of your GDP to climate losses, it just tells you how tragic this whole situation is. And so a level 5 exceeding that projected for wealthier regions, this is always the tragedy, that we will lose another 12%, but for wealthier regions, literally they will lose minimal from this climate change. Africa's youth, which is the people that we work with in Lapid and the people that we are very passionate about, ensuring that their their future is secure, their present future is secure, are the majority demographic in the continent. And they're on the front line of this crisis. Without substantial support, they face a future marred by not just in lack of economic opportunities, which is the story across the continent, but one that is marred by instability and compromised well-being. And I'm going to spend a bit more time on the youth later on, because I think they're a big part of the conversation we need to have in COP29 as far as the loss and damage fund goes. As usual, there's a whole role of the wealthiest in the climate impact. The Guardian report recently highlighted a stark reality that the world's wealthiest 1% emit more carbon than the poorest 50%. I'm going to repeat that. The world's wealthiest 1% emit more than the poorest 50% aggregated. In short, we are paying the price of a wealthy population. And this discrepancy is largely due to the high emission luxury activities that we all know about. And these activities exacerbate your climate impact globally, increase hunger, increase poverty, increase mortality rates. And if everyone emitted at the rate of the average billionaire, if we all decided we are going to compete against your average billionaire, the global carbon budget would be in some numbers that we cannot stand to even think about. And so given this context, there's a whole conversation around the ethical imperative of wealthier nations, and individuals to contribute more, both the nations and the individuals to contribute more to climate mitigation. And I want to highlight that this loss and damage, even as we think about where the funds will come from, and Taproot has done some fantastic work of figuring out some places that some of these funds could be raised from. But it's not just thinking about the wealthier nations, but we're thinking about the wealthier nations and individuals to contribute to the climate mitigation. And implementing policies to tax high emission activities is something that's not just an ethical issue, but it's also a financial accountability kind of process. Much needed revenue that's needed for transition to clean energy and compensating communities that are most affected by global heating, such as those supported by the Loss and Damage Fund. So that's sort of a conversation that we all have had around the ethical and the financial accountability of the wealthiest. It is sad that we still need to keep highlighting this, but I think it's important because in many ways, many people think about the Loss and Damage Fund as Africans begging. We must go back with always the conversation of we're actually not begging. We are asking for people to be held accountable for the chaos that they've contributed to in today's world. It's not a favor that we, or a begging situation that we are going for. I'm also wanted to highlight on the carbon credit, and all this still go back to your loss and damage because they set context to it. And you may have had that conversation already, but I wanted to make sure that I just cover the base for it. If you're part of the Africa Climate Summit that was held in Kenya, that even a lot of us ended up being locked out of, which is just the tragedy of the African stories, is there was a lot of conversation, and our government has been seen to do this, a lot of conversation of pushing the the carbon credits as a pathway and as a solution to offset the emissions. And in reality, that's not serving your people on the ground. If you think about Kenya as an example, we probably are the best example of what carbon colonialism would look like. And there are projects in places like Savo, and you can read about this online, that have this carbon credit perpetuating your global inequalities. I mean, it's bad enough that we're creating a situation where climate change is causing more poverty, but it's even more tragic that the solutions that we come up with leave those communities even still lost, even more lost in today's global inequalities. This project in Savo that aims to prevent deforestation by protecting local forests, but with carbon credits, it was sold to corporations in developed countries. So while we're talking about what it looks like for us to mitigate against climate change, we are thinking about let's have forests. Our forests are being sold. Recently, we had a conversation on Twitter. You should follow Kenyans on Twitter, and especially our youth and Gen Z. And they were having a conversation around our forests and how our forests are being sold to developed countries so that we make short-term money And we enable them with having your carbon emissions. So they continue their carbon emissions, we eliminate our forests. Reports have shown that community members often receive minimal benefits from such projects. Local communities who rely on the land for subsistence farming are restricted in their access, leading to tension and economic hardship. And this type of carbon colonialism shifts the responsibility of emission reduction from wealthy emitters to communities that are already facing social and economic challenges. If you look at our neighbors in Uganda, at the Mount Elgon National Park, there is a project that displaced indigenous communities as the forested areas were converted into protected zones for carbon offsets. And the indigenous people were forced out of that land that they had relied on for centuries, ultimately impacting their livelihoods and their traditional way of life in the name of carbon credits. And then you have your carbon leakages in the Brazilian Amazon, and I'm sure many of you have read about this. Where you have in Brazil, your projects that were designed to protect forested areas from logging and land clearing. However, studies have shown that while deforestation rates within the project area declined, the logging activity simply shifted to neighboring areas, a phenomenon that's currently known as carbon leakage. And this shifting of emissions undermines the effectiveness of the carbon offsets, as the same amount of carbon continues to be released, just in a different location. You can go across the world, you can go to Zimbabwe, and you will find a conversation around transparency and accountability issues as far as the carbon credits go. You will go to Brazil and you will find Shell at the forefront, and I'm sure in Nigeria you even have bigger projects where you've documented around how the energy company Shell has been a significant buyer of carbon credits, promoting its investment in forest projects in places like Indonesia and Brazil. I would love to hear that case scenario, and I'm sure there's a case study in Nigeria of the same. But investigations have shown that these projects often lack verifiable impacts, with some even leading to ecological damage. Shell's use of these credits for greenwashing has sparked global criticism, as they rely on offsets to maintain high levels of fossil fuel production rather than committing to a meaningful emission cuts. And so ultimately, the point here, Mozambique, Tanzania, across the continent, are examples of how carbon credits are just being used to greenwash and create a new form of carbon colonialism. And so as we have conversations about climate, we must be careful not to be sorting out one problem and creating another problem that's going to increase the global inequalities. I have a feeling I probably have gone more than I was supposed to go with this conversation. I will finish with one more thought around the loss and damage conversation and some urgent conversations that we can have at COP29. So what I've done so far is I have set the pace with some sort of thoughts around where we are with the climate change in Kenya, in Africa. Hopefully the conversations you will continue to have. But I wanted to just end with '29. I also hope that the internet is not locking me out. If it is, Martin, this is yours to figure out. But I hope that it's being able to hold itself. So anyway, let me just finish with some thoughts. I think the first challenge that we are having as far as loss and damage fund goes is around the governance models. There's a whole conversation around who is gonna host this fund. And the preference of the West has been for them to host the fund in World Bank. My view and a lot of the views of the people within the Lapid community and a lot of the movements locally, you will hear people saying that that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense for us to be talking about a climate issue that was created by the West, but you will create a loss and damage fund that's going to be hosted in World Bank. There's a study that was done recently by Oxfam, and I think I'm going to mention it later on, that even just goes ahead and explores even what World Bank is doing at present in terms of the funds that they've created. The kind of transparency that you need to create real change, you cannot see it in that context. And so we need to explore alternative governance models. I know this is a hard conversation, but we must have a conversation. we must be able to say World Bank doesn't work for us. And what if we accepted that there are other models that exist across other communities that can be able to help us to have alternative governance models that serve the people. And so traditional top-down governance structures, which is what World Bank represents, often fail to capture the unique perspectives and needs of communities most affected by climate change. They are too detached to know. In Kenya, we had some huge Gen Z-led kind of movements a few months ago. And it was because we had a finance bill that was being brought down, that top-down governance structure from your World Bank and IMF's kind of institutions, but which are very disconnected in terms of the cost of living that your typical Kenyan has to live with, in addition to the bad governance that we have to live with. So the traditional top-down governance structures will fail to capture the unique perspectives and needs of communities that are most affected by climate change. And so we need an inclusive approach that prioritizes community-led models. One of the models that I have seen, also Taproot, for example, doing quite a bit of work around, and again, I will encourage you guys to go check it out, is around the People's Assembly movement. I think about it as a big name of things that we've done for a long time in the African context, but it gives some structure to it. So People's Assembly movements could be possibilities that we could explore for governance of this loss and damage fund. It originates from various social movements across the world. People's Assemblies are platforms for community-led decision making. And so thinking about climate finance, this approach empowers local communities to voice their needs and shape interventions directly. So for example, there's a movement in Brazil called the Brazilian Landless Workers Movement that organizes assemblies to decide on land use, to organize on agricultural practices in ways that prioritize environmental sustainability and social equity. Such assemblies ensure that decisions align with the lived experiences of those on the ground, creating a governance structure that reflects the diversity of frontline communities. Ultimately, what People's Assemblies give us an opportunity for frontline assemblies to determine where the funds are used, to get over this whole idea that other people know better than us what we need. The other thought to think about as we think about the governance of this loss and damage fund is around participatory budgeting. This whole idea of, in Kenya, we're having this whole idea of, we have a fantastic constitution that entrenched the public participation in all big movements. So for example, even when you do budgeting, ideally, you should have public participation to it. And because of that, actually, last year, the budget ended up being taken to court, and the court actually threw it away. There's a whole conversation going on around how now the court has returned it, but let's not go there. But the whole idea behind our constitution is anchoring it on public participation, people participation in budgeting. And this is not a favor, because ultimately we raise the capital, we raise the taxes, we are taxed. So it doesn't make sense for a government somewhere to sit and then determine for us how those funds will be used. And so participatory budgeting as a model is something that we need to explore, widely used in cities like Brazil. In India, it has communities where it is heavily used, which allows communities to decide on public budget allocation. Local residents participate in deciding how funds are allocated to infrastructure, social projects in their neighborhoods. Adopting a similar model for the loss and damage fund could allow communities to prioritize projects that address specific impacts such as a flood prevention or drought resilience, ultimately enabling the communities to build the power that they need to govern themselves and to be ready even for the climate change that comes with it. Community-based governance in indigenous lands. If you go to a lot of communities, indigenous communities, you find there have been practices where they managed their land through community-based governance structures. This is prevalent across Africa. That's why Ubuntu is our reality, where decisions about natural resources, development, and conservatism were made collectively. We now have adopted a lot of what we call democratic governance that I personally do not see. that is based on one powerful human being, and the rest of us then bow down to one powerful human being. But if you look at our history, you find governance that was based on collective leadership models, collective councils, and we need to advocate for those community-based governance that is then prevalent in a lot of indigenous communities today. And applying these models to the Loss and Damage Fund could create governance councils comprising of local representatives who bring cultural and ecological knowledge to climate resilience as strategies. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is there is opportunity for us to innovate the governance of the Loss and Damage Fund. And worst case scenario, if we must put a significant portion into World Bank, because that is the world for today, can we also set apart some funds for experimenting with other possibilities? And those funds then are used to experiment with community-led governance, participatory budgeting, people assemblies, so that perhaps over time we innovate new models for governing loss damage fund and other funds that will need to be created as the climate issue becomes even more urgent. Ultimately, we must empower communities. There's a world that's coming where we cannot all be running to America to be able to get funds. And that therefore means the bigger goal for today must be to activate powerful local communities. The other thing I wanted to bring on top here, table, I think I have two more things and I have to close this, I think I've talked about this, decentralizing decision-making, having regional hubs that locally manage the resources. I'm not going to go into that. There's a whole conversation that also needs to be had around capacity building. If you're going to go the route of empowering communities, enabling communities to govern the loss and damage fund, then we should be equally investing in capacity building to ensure that the local institutions are ready for those funds. And so making sure that these funds have some innovation funds set aside, have some capacity building set aside to training programs for climate financing, building local environment governance bodies. For example, Rwanda, I think, has this green fund that is interesting to be able to study, but to be able to create green funds, but not just create green funds, also create the capacity to manage and account for those green funds. So there's a whole possibility around capacity building, partnerships with local universities for capacity building. We work closely with universities in Kenya, and we found that they have a lot of capacity that is not deployed to the communities. And so the Loss and Damage Fund could foster similar partnerships, connecting local institutions which have academic resources that then strengthen the technical skills and enable for more climate resilience in the projects. I wanted to highlight one last thing. There's something here I've written, and this note, as I shared, I'm going to be shared. The bigger gap that also needs to be talked about in COP is securing the actual commitments. We can't be going around this conversation forever. We have some pledges that have been made. We still have significant gaps. The FDB projects that Africa faces annual climate finance gaps of $213 billion until 2030. I'm going to repeat that. The Africa Development Bank projects that Africa faces an annual climate finance gap of $213 billion until 2030. Every year we have that as a gap until 2030. And this gap underscores the urgent need for robust, reliable financial commitments, not words, not COPs, not events. We need to get to actual commitments. To bridge this, COP29 must establish binding commitments from developed nations, moving beyond voluntary pledges to enforceable financial contributions. We really cannot afford to postpone this. Our reality is we have this $213 billion gap every year. And do you know how we are fixing that gap? We are fixing that gap through debt. Expensive debt. There's a paper that we did a couple of months ago that showed up in Kenya, the debt that we have, we are in a debt crisis. We are basically, all the government does today is pay debts. And why is that? The debts that we took, the climate, the debt that we've taken at 5 times interest than your average country. So that means when you're paying your interest, you're paying 5 times more your other person who has taken that debt. And in reality, the debt that we're taking right now is as a result of the pandemic. That wasn't a Kenyan or an African problem. but we ended up with high levels of debt that need to be paid 5 times more. And even with this climate gap, we are paying it with debts. What that looks like is that means we're not investing in our education, we're not investing in our health. And so we do not have the luxury of keeping on having conversations of climate finance. We need reliable financial commitments. We need to supplement government contributions also by including global carbon taxes. We need to ask, how do we tax the wealthiest so that they also contribute to these global emissions and this loss and damage fund? Transparency is critical. The loss and damage fund should maintain a real-time digital reporting and independent auditing systems that are accessible to the public, to both the donor and recipient countries. Previous challenges such as 41 billion being unaccounted for, which is what was recently flagged, underscore the importance of building trust through robust accountability systems. And so the point here being, one, we need real commitments. Two, we need to have innovative ways to even be able to raise additional funds. And ultimately, we need to leverage on digital tools to have kind of real-time reporting and accountability systems. The last point I want to bring here, and this could actually be a whole conversation, we have to remember that Africa's majority are youth and children. 70% of our populations are youth and children. And that's to say that they are the most impacted demographic. I know in many conversations that I go to, people talk about the youth and children like a subset, a part of the problem. That's not Africa's truth. Africa's truth is our reality is the majority of the continent is youth and children. And so we need to think about youth as agents of change, not passive recipients. They are potential leaders in climate resilience. And so we need to ask, how do we include them in the fund's governance? How do we include them in ensuring their perspectives shape climate resilience strategies? I personally would love to be part of a movement that we create with the Nigerian, with Zambia, with Kenya, and other organizations that enables the youth to stop being passive recipients of the loss and damage fund or conversations on the loss and damage fund. There's a lot of gap around climate education. There's a lot of possibilities of our youth leading us towards that climate resilience, but it needs quite a bit of organizing so that it becomes a reality. The Loss and Damage Fund represents a historic opportunity to confront climate injustice directly. However, its promise will only be realized through a decisive action at COP29. We must establish governance structures that are inclusive, accessible, and regionally responsive, secure binding financial commitments, ensure robust transparency, activate African youth and communities to lead in shaping the climate future. Because for Africa's communities, frontline communities, for Africa's frontline communities, for the young leaders of tomorrow, for all those who bear the brunt of climate change, we have more than a moral responsibility to act. Climate change knows no borders, neither should our commitment to equality, equity, and justice know any borders. The time for action is now. Let's seize this moment and have those conversations, and hopefully, more than conversations, have some action to support it. I know this has been heavy. I know it's been a lot. But hopefully it gives us some thoughts that we could sit with even as we approach the COP29 conversations. Once again, a big thank you for hosting me and having me in this conversation. It's always a privilege to contribute to any conversation on climate change in between my anger. And thank you for ensuring that this is not just a Nigerian conversation, but it's an African conversation, it's a global conversation. I look forward to us having many of such conversations even in the future. Thank you.